Story 1. The silence was the first thing to get to him. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a vast, unyielding emptiness that swallowed every rustle of his parka and every crunch of his boot. Elias knew the cold would be a constant companion in this part of Alaska, the kind of cold that bit at exposed skin and made his lungs ache, but he hadn't anticipated the quiet. It was the sound of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. He had come to the abandoned research station, designated Outpost Chimera, for that very reason. He wanted to be forgotten. A year ago, a careless miscalculation during a mountain rescue operation had cost a man his life. Elias had been the team leader. The internal inquiry had cleared him of fault, but the man's widow's eyes, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to vibrate, had clung to him like a curse. He had quit the service, sold his gear, and driven north until the asphalt gave way to ice, and the last vestiges of civilization were 100 miles of frozen tundra behind him. The old outpost, a relic from a forgotten Cold War survey, was the end of the line. The station was a collection of prefab shelters linked by a covered walkway, a single satellite dish rusting on a tripod, and a small, wind-whipped hangar. Drifts of snow, packed hard as cement, had piled against the walls, encasing the place in a glacial tomb. The government had forgotten it, and the elements had been busy erasing it. Elias spent the first week simply getting the place habitable. He fired up the diesel generator, a stubborn beast that protested with a gout of black smoke before humming to life. He cleared the snow from the solar panels, a secondary power source that would at least keep the lights on during the brief, pale daylight hours. The main cabin, a single room with a cot, a table, and a pot-bellied stove, became his sanctuary. He lived on canned goods, dried fish, and the occasional rabbit he managed to trap, the meat tough but satisfying. The days were a simple rhythm of survival. Chopping wood, melting snow for water, checking the comms equipment that, to his relief, still worked, though the nearest satellite link was sporadic at best. At night, with the wind howling outside and the stove casting a warm, orange glow, he would read from the few dusty books left behind. The solitude, he thought, was a balm. It was a purgatory of his own choosing, a penance. But after a fortnight, the silence began to shift. He would be working on a piece of equipment, lost in the focused rhythm of the task, when a different kind of quiet would descend. A breathless, expectant stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. He would freeze, his senses on high alert, his heart thrumming in his ears, but there would be nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the profound, oppressive hush. It was in these moments that he felt he was not alone. He found the journal on the 20th day. It was tucked away in a small, locked filing cabinet in the back of the main hangar, hidden beneath a pile of old survey charts. The journal was bound in a worn, dark red leather, and the pages were filled with tight, meticulous handwriting. It belonged to a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, the last known occupant of the outpost, a geophysicist who had vanished without a trace in the late 1960s. The official report, which Elias had found in a tattered folder, simply listed him as missing. Elias took the journal back to his cabin, a fresh cup of instant coffee steaming on the table. He flipped through the early entries. They were dry, scientific accounts of magnetic field anomalies, seismic readings, and geological observations. Dr. Finch was a professional, and his writing reflected it. October 17, 1968. The anomaly persists. It is not an artifact of the equipment. The gravimetric readings are off the charts, suggesting a massive subsurface object of incredible density. It is localized to a point approximately 5 miles due north of the outpost, beneath the ice sheet. It is unnatural. A geological formation should not generate this kind of magnetic interference. I am logging a report to Anchorage, but I do not expect them to understand the scale of this. I have begun a series of deeper core samples in the vicinity." Elias read on, his scientific curiosity piqued. He knew the history of these kinds of Cold War expeditions. They were often driven by a mix of genuine research and a veiled search for strategic minerals or, more often, a way to gain an advantage in a new frontier. But Finch's entries became less about science and more about a mounting, irrational obsession. November 2, 1968. The core samples confirm my hypothesis. The geological strata are completely irregular. They don't match any known formation. The rock, it's not rock. It's like a composite of different crystalline structures fused together at an impossible temperature. It seems to have a faint, phosphorescent glow when removed from the ice. I am keeping a sample in the lab hangar. It pulses. I can feel it. The writing grew more erratic. The lines less straight, the words more rushed. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. November 15, 1968. The whispers. I hear them now, not just outside, but inside the cabin. They come from the walls. They sound like the wind, but they speak to me. They tell me things about the ice, about the endless dark below. It is beautiful. It is the truest thing I have ever known. It is waiting to be found. Elias slammed the journal shut. The quiet in his cabin was no longer a bomb. It was a shroud. He stood up, pacing the small room, his gaze darting from the walls to the windows, which were now just a sheet of frosted-over plexiglass. He felt it now, the cold that wasn't from the outside. A deep, bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate from the ground beneath the cabin. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of his mind, a product of isolation and the macabre history of the place. He was an adventurer, a man of logic and reason. This was just a man's descent into madness, preserved on a page. But he could not shake the feeling that Finch's madness was a fever, and he was beginning to feel the first tremors of it himself. The next day, Elias decided to follow Finch's footsteps. He put on his warmest gear, a GPS unit, and a small bag with a hammer, a pry bar, and a headlamp. He followed the coordinates Finch had listed in an early entry, a point due north, 5 miles out. The trek was grueling. The snow was a shifting, treacherous terrain, and the wind, a razor-sharp force, sliced at his face. But he pushed on, driven by a morbid fascination. He found it at the foot of a small, jagged rock outcropping. It was a makeshift drill site, a massive, rusted auger protruding from the snow, half buried in a drift. It was here that Finch must have done his sampling. Elias approached, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knelt down and used his hands to dig away the snow from the base of the auger. Buried in the ice, he found a small, heavy wooden crate. It was sealed with heavy-duty metal clamps. He used the pry bar to snap the clamps. The crate groaned open, and a blast of frigid air, far colder than the surrounding atmosphere, washed over him. He recoiled, shivering. Inside, nestled on a bed of felt, was a sample of the rock Finch had described. It was a dark, impossibly smooth stone, not black, but an absence of color, like a hole in reality. It had a faint, sickly green luminescence. It pulsed, just as Finch had written. Not with light, but with an internal vibration that Elias could feel in his fingertips, a low, thrumming hum that resonated deep in his bones. He snatched his hand back. The stone felt alive. He quickly closed the crate, reclamped it, and, without a second thought, hauled the heavy thing back with him. The return journey was a blur of fear and exhaustion. The silence was back, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, menacing presence, a cold and watchful gaze he felt on his back. He stumbled back into his cabin, numb with cold and fear. He shoved the crate under his cot and piled blankets on top of it. He needed to think. He needed to be rational. He was a man, and it was a rock. That's all. But the night that followed was a descent into pure terror. The whispers began, faint at first, then growing in volume until they were a chorus of disembodied voices coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, a chittering, guttural sound that was like the grinding of a glacier. The pot-bellied stove, his source of warmth and comfort, seemed to lose its power. The air in the cabin grew colder and colder, a deep, penetrating chill that no amount of fire could combat. He watched the mercury in the thermometer drop, the red line receding as if drawn by a vengeful hand. He opened the journal again, the pages now seeming to hum with a malevolent energy. He flipped to the final entries. They were almost illegible, a scrawling, mad dance of a man's final moments. December 2, 1968. They are here now. The voices. They tell me of the cold. The true cold. Not of this world. It is the cold of something older than the sun. Something that has slept for millennia beneath the ice, waiting for something, for someone, to wake it. I brought it a gift. A piece of myself. It whispers its thanks. December 3, 1968. The ice, it has a face. I see it in the drifts outside the window. A face of unimaginable cruelty, its eyes the starless night. It is not just the rock. It is the presence. The gloom below. It wants to know me. It wants to see what I have learned. It is a hunger. I must give it the gift. I must go to it. The final page was a single, sprawling sentence that seemed to have been carved with a desperate hand. It sees me. It will know me. It will consume me whole. Elias dropped the journal. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The cold had now reached a point that defied logic. Frost was forming on the inside of his windows, and his breath came out in a thick cloud of vapor. The whispers were now a clear, resonant chant, and they were in English. They were his voice. The voice of the man he failed to save on the mountain. You left me, the voice echoed from the corner of the room, a bone-chilling whisper that ripped at his sanity. You let me fall. Elias screamed, a hoarse, primal sound that was instantly swallowed by the frigid air. He grabbed his coat, his axe, anything. He had to get out. He had to run. He had to abandon the outpost, the journal, the cursed rock. He would rather face the tundra than face this. He burst out of the cabin, the wind a physical punch to his chest. The sky was a bruised, starless purple, the last remnants of a day that was already fading into a long night. He ran, blindly at first, his boots sinking in the deep snow, his legs burning with effort. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the outpost. He ran for what felt like hours, the bitter cold a constant agony. He stumbled, falling face first into a drift. When he pushed himself up, his headlamp beam cut through the swirling snow, revealing a chilling sight. He had run in a perfect circle. He was back at the outpost. The faint, phosphorescent glow of the rock box beneath his cot pulsed from within the cabin window, a beacon calling to him. The whispers intensified, coming from every direction now. From the wind, from the snow, from the frozen ground. They were the voices of the dead, a chorus of suffering that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The voices of every living thing that had ever been swallowed by the cold. He looked at the small, glowing square in the window, and an irrational, terrifying thought came to him. It wasn't just a rock. It was a fragment of a mind. An ancient, malignant mind that had been sleeping under the ice, a mind of pure cold and endless hunger. And he had brought it a part of himself, just as Finch had. He had brought it his guilt, his grief, his fear. He had brought it a memory. The memory of a man falling to his death, a life extinguished in the unforgiving cold. The whispers coalesced into a single, terrifying thought in his mind. Give it to me. Give me the memory. The taste of your grief. Elias backed away slowly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the vast, featureless landscape, the towering peaks in the distance, and the knowledge hit him with the force of a physical blow. There was nowhere to run. The entity wasn't just in the outpost. It was the land itself. It was the gloom below. The cold was its presence, the silence was its breath, and the whispers were its voice. He turned and faced the cabin. The front door was now a gaping maw, a black hole in the fading light. He could feel it pulling him in, a gravitational tug of sheer malevolence. He gripped the axe in his hand, a futile gesture against a force that was older than time. He had to make a choice: be consumed by the cold, or give himself to the fire. He thought of the man on the mountain. He saw his face, the pale, shocked expression as he slipped from Elias's grasp. He felt the cold shock of the air as he fell. The guilt was a heavy weight, a cancer on his soul. And the gloom below wanted it. It wanted to consume his pain, to devour his guilt, to feast on the very essence of his broken spirit. With a final, defiant yell, Elias raised the axe. But he did not swing at the door. He swung at the ice, at the very ground beneath his feet, a desperate, irrational act of defiance. The axe blade bit into the frozen earth with a dull thud. The ground groaned in response. A chasm opened up at his feet, a black void that seemed to exhale a blast of frigid air. The whispers screamed now, a triumphant chorus that echoed his fear. He looked into the chasm, and he saw it. Not a creature, not a beast, but a vision of pure, unimaginable cold. A world of crystalline spires and frozen rivers, where light was an anomaly and warmth was a forgotten myth. It was the mind of the gloom below, and it was reaching for him. Elias did not fight it. He let go. He let himself fall, a final, despairing act of surrender. He felt the cold embrace him, a chilling comfort that promised an end to his torment. The last thing he saw was the small, phosphorescent glow of the cursed rock, a single star in a universe of pure, unfeeling ice, sinking into the endless dark below. The voices of the dead were silent now, replaced by a single, final whisper, a voice that was his and yet not his. Welcome home. The silence returned to the outpost, a deeper, more profound quiet than before. The wind still howled, and the snow still fell, but the world was no longer empty. It had a new voice. A new memory. And it was waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to come looking. The gloom below had tasted human grief, and it was no longer satisfied. It was hungry. Story 2. The wind was a constant, keening wail that scoured the exposed rock and drove splinters of ice against the plexiglass window of the hut. For the first 2 weeks, Dr. Aris Thorne had listened to it like a metronome for his own sanity. It was a sound that had no beginning and no end, a perfect expression of the empty, unforgiving world outside. He had come to the Desolation Glacier to document its final death throes, a scientific mission that felt, increasingly, like an elegy for the world he had left behind. His real reason for being here was simpler: to disappear. Back home, in the crowded, humid warmth of the city, his life had become a ruin. A misread seismic report, a catastrophic failure on a corporate drilling site, and the subsequent lawsuit had cost him his reputation and his livelihood. He had retreated to the highest, coldest point on earth he could find, a place where no one would ask him about the past, and where the only sound was the howling of the wind and the groaning of the ancient ice. His base of operations was a prefabricated hut, barely larger than a shipping container, anchored to a bedrock ridge a few miles from the glacier's terminus. It was equipped with a small generator, a cot, and an array of sophisticated geological sensors. His days were a monotonous cycle of collecting data, charting the glacier's retreat, and analyzing the newly exposed rock for signs of life, however small. The nights were a testament to the solitude. He would sit by the sputtering kerosene lamp, the only light for 100 miles, and try not to think. It was on a particularly clear and windless morning, a rare and unsettling calm, that he saw it. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long, spectral shadows across the cracked, glacial ice. Just below the ridge, where the ice sheet met a jumble of black, jagged boulders, was a perfect, man-made cairn. His heart thrummed a strange, arrhythmic beat. A cairn, a pile of stones marking a trail or a summit. But there was no trail here. No summit. He had been told this region was utterly uninhabited, a place so remote even the Inuit had legends about its emptiness. Who could have built it? When? And why? He grabbed his parka, his boots, and his small geological hammer. The walk down was treacherous, the newly exposed rock slick with meltwater and coated in a treacherous layer of frost. When he reached the site, his sense of bewilderment only deepened. The cairn was flawless, a conical stack of stones with an impossible precision. The rocks were of a kind he didn't recognize, dark and veined with a strange, coppery luminescence. There was no frost on them, no moss or lichen. They looked as if they had been placed there yesterday. He knelt and reached out to touch the lowest stone. It was cold, but not with the biting cold of the Arctic air. It was a deep, internal cold, a chill that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the rock, and when he touched it, he felt a faint vibration, a low hum that seemed to resonate in the marrow of his bones. He snatched his hand back. It was then that he saw the crack. A fissure in the bedrock beside the cairn, no bigger than a finger, but it pulsed with that same unnatural luminescence. Curiosity overriding caution, he put his ear to the crack. He heard nothing at first, just the low hum of the rock. Then, faint and distant, he heard something else. A whisper. Not a whisper on the wind, but a whisper from within the earth itself. It was the sound of a voice, distorted and stretched thin by millennia of frozen time, a voice that was not speaking in words, but in a kind of pure, raw thought. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in facts and figures and observable phenomena. This was not possible. A sound from within the rock. A voice. He told himself it was the cold, the isolation, a trick of the ear. He took a sample of the luminescent rock and carefully wrapped it in a cloth, placing it in his pack. He then made the long, silent journey back to the hut, the silent hum of the rock in his bag a constant, unsettling companion. That night, the whispers returned. They were no longer faint. They were clear, distinct, and they were in his head. They spoke a language that was not a language at all, but a series of fragmented thoughts, feelings, and memories that weren't his own. He heard the sound of footsteps on stone, of a glacier cracking, of a deep, resonant hum. He heard a voice, a woman's voice, call a name that was not his own, a name that felt like a sharp, cold shard of grief. The words were incoherent, but the emotion was raw and palpable. He heard a whisper, and a single phrase, clear and terrifying, burned itself into his mind: the weight of the ice is a lie. He spent the next day poring over his maps, his mind a frantic jumble of scientific discipline and pure, unadulterated fear. He found no record of any past expeditions to the area. This was a virgin territory, a place that, according to all geological records, should have been pristine and untouched. He needed context. He needed a logical explanation. He remembered the legend of the lost expedition of 1908, a party of British geographers who had vanished while charting the northernmost reaches of Greenland. Their last known position was a few hundred miles from his own. Could they have been the ones to build the cairn? It was a desperate, grasping hope, but it was the only thing that made sense. He decided to go back. This time, he would be methodical. He took a more advanced set of sensors, a high-resolution camera, and a small, battery-powered drill. The journey felt different this time. The silence of the windless air was no longer a calm, but a breathless, expectant hush. He felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for him. He reached the cairn and began his work. He took readings with the magnetometer, the gravimeter, the seismometer. The instruments went haywire. The magnetic field was in a state of impossible flux. The gravimetric readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive, localized density beneath the surface. The seismic sensor picked up a faint, rhythmic vibration, the same hum he had felt when he first touched the stone. He carefully placed the sensor against the rock face of the cairn. The hum became a clear, undeniable sound. It was a tone, a pure, resonant note that seemed to vibrate with a purpose. He recorded it. He then set up his drill. He needed a core sample of the bedrock itself, to see if the strange rock from the cairn was a local anomaly. The drill bit, a diamond-tipped marvel of engineering, whined and spun against the stone. It didn't bite. It scraped and sparked, but it didn't penetrate. The rock of the ridge was harder than anything he had ever encountered, harder than diamond, harder than any known mineral. It was as if the very earth itself was resisting him. Frustrated, he stood up and turned to look at the glacier. The silence was broken by the sickening sound of a fracture, a gunshot crack that echoed across the ice. A new chasm had opened, a long, black gash that stretched for 100 yards. As he watched, the ice groaned, and a towering spire of glacial ice, a cathedral of ancient blue, separated from the main mass and toppled, a slow-motion avalanche of sheer, cold power. The sound of the collapse was a thunder that shook the ground. And then, in his head, the whispers became a scream. It was a scream of pure, visceral agony, a shriek that ripped through his mind and tore at his sanity. It was the woman's voice he had heard before, now joined by a man's, and the voices were screaming in terror and despair. He stumbled back, his mind reeling from the assault. He fell against the cairn. As his hands touched the cold, humming stones, a torrent of images flooded his mind. He saw a man, pale and gaunt, his face a mask of terror, standing on this very spot. He saw a woman, her eyes wide with fear, holding a child. He saw a group of men, dressed in heavy wool and leather, their faces chiseled with exhaustion. They were the lost expedition. They hadn't just gotten lost. They had found something. The images came faster and faster, a horrifying montage of fear and madness. He saw the men digging, their faces filled with a strange, feverish obsession. He saw them building the cairn, placing the stones with a frantic, desperate reverence. He saw them listening to the whispers, their eyes growing empty and dark. And then, he saw the final moment. A moment of pure, blinding terror. He saw the man, the one from the scream, standing alone, the cairn before him. The whispers were a chorus now, a symphony of torment. The man raised a hand, a gesture of surrender or supplication, and then he simply vanished. Not a trace, not a body, just an absence. A void. Aris pulled his hands away from the cairn, gasping for breath, his mind a fractured landscape of fear and borrowed memories. He now understood. The cairn was not a marker. It was a cage. And the whispers were not a voice. They were a hunger. The cairn was a prison for something ancient, something that lived in the heart of the rock, something that fed on life, on consciousness, on fear. It was not a creature. It was a void, a dark echo of existence that had been trapped beneath the weight of the ice for eons. The melting of the glacier had weakened the prison, and now it was hungry. The whispers spoke to him again, a seductive chorus of fractured thoughts, promising him understanding, promising him a release from his own guilt. They spoke of the man from the drilling site, of the final moments of his life, a vision of his fear-stricken face as the earth gave way beneath his feet. The voices told him that they knew his guilt, they knew his pain, and they wanted it. They wanted to consume it. He scrambled to his feet. He had to get out. He had to warn someone. But as he turned to run, the ground began to shake. Not with the violent tremors of an earthquake, but with a low, rhythmic vibration that was the sound of the cairn's hum, amplified 1,000 times. The ice, a solid, ancient thing, began to crack and groan around him. The bedrock itself seemed to writhe and shift. The whispers in his mind were now a roar, a deafening cacophony of fear and torment. The voices of the dead, of the lost expedition, of all the forgotten souls who had been swallowed by the cold, were screaming. They were warning him. They were telling him to run. He looked at the hut on the ridge, a distant, impossible beacon of safety. He knew he wouldn't make it. The land was alive now, a malevolent force that had been awakened. It was coming for him. He dropped his pack and his hammer. He reached for his satellite phone, his fingers numb and fumbling with the keys. He had to get a message out. He had to leave a record. He had to tell someone what was here. What was beneath the ice. He managed to punch in the coordinates of his location, a frantic, desperate string of numbers. He started to type a message, his mind racing, trying to find the words to describe the unimaginable. The cairn. It's not a marker. It's a tomb. It's a prison. He looked up, and he saw it. The air above the cairn was shimmering, a distortion in reality, a mirage of pure, cold malice. The hum from the rock was now so loud he could feel it rattling his teeth. He stopped typing. The whispers in his mind were no longer fragmented. They were a single, coherent thought, a voice that was his, and yet not his. A voice that had been consumed and reshaped by something terrible and ancient. It will know you. It will consume you whole. The weight of the ice is a lie. He looked at the satellite phone in his hand, a pointless piece of technology in the face of a force that was older than human history. He smiled, a slow, terrible smile that felt alien on his face. He no longer felt fear. He felt a profound sense of peace. The void had found a new home. He let the phone fall to the ground. He turned and walked back to the cairn. The stones pulsed with a sickly, triumphant light. He reached out and placed his hands on the cold, humming surface. The whispers in his mind were silent now, replaced by a single, resonant note, a tone of pure, unfeeling contentment. A week later, a search and rescue team, responding to Aris's last transmission, found his hut. It was perfectly preserved, his gear neatly stowed, his journal on the desk. But Aris Thorne was gone. The only trace of him was a set of tracks that led down from the ridge, a path that ended abruptly at the foot of a perfect, man-made cairn of strange, coppery stones. The stones were humming. But only if you listened very, very closely. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.